Panel 2 of the day is entitled The Tasks of Abstract Space. And this panel aims to think of mathematics as tools for world making, and thus to confront human reasoning with its blindnesses, as well as accountabilities, historically and practically. When a platform is taken to be a self-contained world, the production of thresholds on that world are also predictions of the behaviors available within its constraints. The availability of destinations allows for calculable predestination, as we saw yesterday. Can we identify new and perhaps uncanny sensations of fate and even destiny in the seizure or mobilization of history and historical belonging as foundational metadata for predictive time, right? So imagine like a higher function of biometrics that knows you and knows what you will do based upon, for example, your family history, your browser, your search history. How do image world modelings scramble modern or postmodern notions of self-reflexivity, seeing oneself seeing, thus registering blindness, as well as notions of authorship and readership in relation to orientation in space, or to purpose, or purposefulness and intentions within time? Our first speaker will be Patricia Reed. The title of her presentation is Orientation in a Big World on the Necessity of Horizonless Perspectives. And Patricia is an artist, writer, and designer based in Berlin. And she will be followed by Matteo Pasquinelli and then Ramon Amaro, and then we will speak together and take questions from the audience. Please join me in welcoming Patricia Reed.
Oh, there we go. Thank you again for sacrificing this beautiful Saturday afternoon. We're really selling it here, I know. I'm really super sick, so if I'm a bit fuzzy in the head and start hacking too much, then I think Brian's gonna come up and maybe share some paragraphs, because I don't know if I can speak for like prolonged time. But don't worry, it's not like a 2-hour talk or something. So the expression the planetary scale frames our general condition of unprecedented complexity, denoting the consequential magnitude of some human techno-economic activity and the totality of their compounded effects. Effects, of course, that supersede the boundaries of Earth. So my question is, can the application of this term in describing how things are be put to use beyond this kind of purely diagnostic state? Could it also potentially serve as a pivotal concept through which the making of other worlds could be practiced? Can this concept of planetary scale function perhaps as a basis for political invention and solidarity, rather than sort of persisting in its current mode of exploiting interconnectivity, driven by the same old-fashioned hubris of profit maximization? So obviously I'm picking the latter part of the question, otherwise I'd just step down now. So I'm going to be pursuing this more optimistic side of the dilemma, and optimistic realism, mind you, and try to think about how navigation could be understood both at and for this planetary scale. So there's 3 sort of factors that immediately come to mind when speculating on the possible transition from an exploitative planetary scale to an emancipatory one. The first, of course, the obvious one, is the critical question of how to contend with scale as such. Since historically, scalar ambitions have come to equate with forms of domination, conformance, and homogenization, as is evidenced by our current version of so-called globalization, as unilateral globalization, to borrow the term from Yu Kuei, as well as the ongoing oppressions of colonial subjection, including its more managerial derivatives. So, second is to ask how the abstract concept of planetary scale works back upon us. So what I'm suggesting is that the planetary scale isn't just an external phenomena, but also has the capacity to transform human self-understanding, from which other possibilities of navigating the world cascade. So what perspectives are opened and which ones are shut down? How does this affect the relative position of where we stand in the world conceptually? And what other logics unfold as a result of that repositioning? How may we narrate the consequences of this perspectival shift in hypothetically meaningful ways? Oh, sorry, I'm not, there we go. Sorry, I should have switched slides there. Is this the right one yet? Wait, there we go. Third concerns cognitive traction, since the planetary scale also describes this kind of object that's so incredibly intricate that it surpasses the capacity for individual heroic human intellection. It can only be partially accessible at a collective or distributive level. So it's my contention that if there's going to be any sort of just political navigation of and at the planetary scale, these fundamental issues need to be accounted for. And it's through this activity of navigating where they can also be seen as symbiotic. So I think, since a lot of you weren't here this morning, where navigation as such was more readily addressed, before diving into navigation specifically at this planetary scale, it seems useful to sort of lay out what navigation is and what it entails, at least how I use the term. So navigation is above all a synthetic operation. First, it's the ongoing mediation of intentionality with contingency, the unknown or accidental events. Navigation is not destination, but is not entirely divorced from destination either. It's a movement of inclination requiring markers of orientation. And if navigation requires inclination to lend a sort of operational or affective valence of directionality to mobility, the politics of navigation are bound to claims on constructing these points of orientation, as well as making them sensible. So second, we're kind of moving in groups of threes here. Second, navigation is reliant on certain extra-local mental diagram of space and time, which is continually cross-referenced with situated localization. So in this way, navigation embodies the continuum between the conceptual and the material, and it's in this sort of weaving where navigators can continually revise and update their choreography and markers of orientation over time. So for those of you that were here this morning, this maybe is one remedy to the link between the hyper-prescription of navigation that we see in something like Google Maps in our everyday and depression, right? Because it was all about this immobility. So my argument is saying, actually, navigation is about the constant ongoing sort of weaving together of your mental diagram and the situational activity, and continually revising these both modalities as a result. So as the saying goes, of course, we've heard this and it's probably not gonna be the last time today. As the saying goes, the map is not the territory. However, arresting this thought in its purely oppositional state undermines this crucial synthetic dynamic, wherein the map, understood as a sort of diagrammatic artifact, it partially shapes A, the perception and perceptibility of the territory or system, B, how that territory or system is thought to exist beyond immediate sensory feedback, if it's sensible at all, right? Because I'm using territory a bit loosely here, could be a system. C, the possibility spaced of its imagined tractability. And D, the understanding of causal interrelations, which ultimately feed into how we understand agency. So the map, and this could be a story, a drawing, a diagram, a model, or a mathematical projection, may be distinct from the territory or system, but it informs the way we conceive of, access, and figure navigation within it. So abuses of cartography seen in this way, abuses of cartography occur when the extraction of the map remains fixed and unresponsive to situational localization. And last, the activity of navigation, it presupposes the existence of a navigable thing. So when it comes to our present, how navigable is the world today in its complex dimensionality? For whom or what is navigability optimized? For whom or what is it foreclosed on? And through what power dynamics are those affordances determined? This adds another aspect to note in thinking the politics of navigation, namely that we cannot presuppose the affordance of navigability as a given, but we must insist on the necessity for making navigable. That is to construct ways of making the planetary scale amenable to navigation at all. The geometries, narrations, images, interfaces in both operational and linguistic form seem to be in a nascent state if they are in existence at all. So to begin imagining a mode of navigating the planetary scale without it becoming a sort of enactment of enforced uniformity, not to mention the epistemic violence that cascades from this enforcement, we need to approach this problem with the necessity of preserving particularity or difference. How are we to conceive of planetary space while upholding commitments to the distinctions of localization? So otherwise formulated, what are the politics of location at a planetary scale? So broadly speaking, a politics of location provokes an accounting for specificity in order to both sort of shun this sort of fake God's eye trick of neutrality idealisms, as well as the tyranny of reducing the world to a rigidly uniform totality. The question instigates a situated accounting for the local, geo-historical, material context from which one speaks, thinks, relates, learns, and acts as an activity of self-relativization. So the important power of this formulation is that it precisely preserves difference and particularity. Where this account of specificity offers us less guidance, however, is in approaching coherence. And by that I mean simply how all these instances of situated localization cohere systemically in mutually influential and co-constitutive ways, both for the good and for the bad, right? Not all relations are per se good. So one of the central challenges posed by the proposition of political orientation at the planetary scale is basically how do we uphold these two scales simultaneously? It's a mereological part to whole, one to many, and many to one problem, which is about as old as a problem one gets in philosophy. However, the stakes today for finding ways to exist in this concept turn it into an urgent question of social pragmatics. So the shared inclination in this regard already present in the work of Edouard Glissant and his writing on what he called the one world, the tout monde, a one world composed of vastly different worlds, the negotiation of which comes through the enactment of what he called a world mentality. So this was from mondialisation, so globalization, to mondialité, which is, it's more interesting in French, the wordplay. So put briefly, this world mentality, mondialité, opposes the flattening forces of this unilateral globalization, while still upholding a picture of wholeness. But it's a notion of totality as a relationship of each thing or body to all other things. So it's not a kind of smooth, uniform entity. His emphasis on relationality acts to preserve specificity, but what I think is even more crucial to note is that his framing of specificity, it stands against images of difference understood as atomized particularities. His framing is much more about related particularities. And what's important is that this move brings with it the consequence of detaching specificity from individualism, and I think this is a point that needs to be stressed. So specificity and individualism are not intrinsically linked. That had to be constructed. So around the same period, these similar part-to-whole problems were undergoing incredible leaps of invention from the field of mathematics. More precisely, a working through of what René Thom called the founding aporia of mathematics, namely the dialectic between the discrete, so that's the particular or the differential, and the continuous, or the global and the universal. So the mathematician, climate activist, and vehement critic of scientism, Alexander Grothendieck, who co-founded the group Survivre et Vivre, so survive and live, worked on this problem geometrically, arriving at what he'd eventually call arithmetical geometry. So to quote from his lengthy semi-autobiography, Récolte et Semaille, the full title in English being notably Harvest and Sowing, the life of a mathematician, reflections and bearing witness. So it's not exactly the kind of autobiographical title one would expect from a mathematician. So the quote, as for geometry, one can say that in 2,000 years in which it has existed as a science in the modern sense of the word, it has straddled these two kinds of structure, discrete and continuous. One can say that the new geometry, his geometry, is a synthesis between these two worlds, which though next door neighbors and in close solidarity were deemed separate, end quote. So what's important to point out is that both of these authors, obviously from very different disciplines, with both of these authors around the same time, there's no pitting of one scale over the other. They both refuse what I would say is a false choice. And they put their efforts towards the articulation of a kind of glue, or a gluing operation that upholds the discrete and continuous scales. Yeah, so of course each approach delivers their own sets of consequences and context as a result of this application. But with both, we get a mode of refiguring spatial relations, as well as relations to spatiality, that bear important consequences for navigation, including our image of situatedness at a planetary scale. So through the lens of the discrete and the continuous, we can say that locations or sites not only exist in neighborhoods or broader contexts, they are co-constituted by them. There exists an array of relational field conditions that co-produce any instance of localization. So I think today this isn't even an abstract or purely theoretical idea. It's part of our everyday life, even if we don't, sense it directly. Being online entails relations with both the locations that serve as sites for material extraction, the specific laborers doing the work, and additionally the computational parsing of our requests instantiates chain reactions across variously geolocated jurisdictions and entities simultaneously, regardless of the happenstance, proper geolocation of the user. So we are, in operational terms, multiply located, an abstractly distributed form of situatedness. Now, to just be clear, this in no way erases the concretely differential experience of locational embodiment, but it offers a more extensive picture of being situated in view of the path dependencies that make up the planetary scale. So location is constituted by a specificity of experience, but it's irreducible to that which can be directly experienced. So although this may appear to be a kind of useless, trivial academic framing of location, it strikes me that when we use a common term, we hear it very often, like systemic oppression. We're already kind of gesturing to both of these scales of location. So the causal forces of distributed localizations that co-produce a concretely localized experience of oppression. So how is location defined? Excuse me. To define something as local requires the implicit articulation of a threshold. As a term usually taken as self-evident, there are spatial norms and abstractions at work, ones that are rarely made explicit, drawing a border between a general terrain and a particular instance. Now I think this provokes a moment to put certain assumptions to scrutiny. What is the border condition of location? And at what threshold does the local cease to be local? From which perspectival position are these thresholds drawn? And of course, the answer to these questions are many, since what all of these dilemmas of location signal is location is, above all, a relative and not an absolute spatial concept. So how does this sort of multi-scalar understanding of location as a continuum between the concrete and the abstract, how does that affect the relative perspective from which we figure situatedness at a planetary scale? How are we to understand position within this framework if we're to maintain some degree of fidelity to the partiality of objectivity inherent to Haraway's infamous situated knowledges, dependent as it is on locating the knowledge maker? So I think there's a two-way sort of bidirectional answer here. From the specific concrete location of a particular human self and the abstract extra location of human self-images, how we imagine humans in general to be positioned. If the position of human being at planetary scale is a decentered one, that's like one no longer sustainably conceivable as this heroic Euro-humanist human separate from and masterfully dominant over the world. How does this play into the navigational synthesis between the conceptual and the material? That is, in the mutual influence between the abstract and the concrete. Put more simply, how does this decentered human picture work back upon us as a form of a sort of initial abstract diagrammatic agency towards the way we come to envision concrete, particular situatedness in all of this locational dimensionality? So I'd just like to point out that I think there's a pretty important battle for orientation with this decentered human, since there are plenty who are actively pushing to deny any form of navigability from this resituated position, advocating for the dehumanizing fetishization of this navigational turbulence produced by human decentering, right? We don't really know what to do with ourselves at the moment. In a navigational paradigm, we can recall that making claims on markers of orientation is constitutive of its politics. So denying navigability absolutely is equal to depoliticization. So basically there's an equation between the dehumanizing thrust of this type of thought and its depoliticization. So how are claims to be made on these markers in service of human non-centrality? Markers that may orient us towards the construction of other genres of being human, to borrow the expression from Sylvia Wynter. Genres of being human made to the measure of the planetary. So Wynter crucially noted that today, of course, none of our reality would be possible without the initial construction of the economic genre of being human. So the point I just want to sort of make here is that significant epistemic and political changes are sort of bound to how genres of being human are conceived. So part of answering to the question of genres of being human made to the measure of the planetary, I think we can start perhaps in the negative, right? Because these are big questions and I'm afraid I don't have the mega answer right now, nor will it come from one person. But we can at least start chipping away, like a piece of stone, chipping away at what we don't want. So there's no desire to repeat the violent precedent of creating global conditions from the absolutizing of a particular. These are always instances of domination stemming from discrete conditions that get magnified to a global scale, forcing the multiplicity of the world into a particular image of it. And that is usually in the familiar image of those doing the oppressing or the dominating. This, to be clear, can be no formula for navigation commensurate with the measure of the planetary. Answering to this scale demands proportionate responses, big world responses that it can account for and be accountable to specificity, complexity, systems of human and non-human interdependence, without the false and oftentimes vicious cognitive comforts of reduction. So it's here I want to note a crucial distinction between the aggrandizement of a particularly situated concept to the scale of the big world versus situating concept creation within a big world perspective. If the imposition of a small world perspective is susceptible to the inflation of particularity, the big world perspective marks a rejection of this tendency, not only on ethical grounds, but epistemological ones as well. A small world perspective is a subtractive correlation to reality, treating the part as the whole, forcing the discrete as the continuous. So spatially and geometrically, it's no coincidence that classical perspective was co-birthed with the concept of the Euro-humanist human, that genre of human centrality where the world is imagined as optimizable in its own familiar image. Correspondingly, in classical perspective, the representation of human vision became mechanized, reproducing images wherein the extra-local vanishes at the threshold of a horizon. This works to reinforce a very narrow depiction of what a location is by extracting it from extra-local relations, merely mimicking the limitations of our biosensory visual system that has a restricted depth of vision and one that tends to privilege immediacy. To be clear, I'm not here to demonize the horizon as such, but simply point out its relative scalar applicability. In some instances, it may prove to be a useful metaphor or device of orientation, especially in our everyday lives, but it can only serve a small word function. So even when it's typically used to describe expansiveness, a becoming, or an unknown future state, at our current scale of reality, the horizon stands in for something quite the opposite. Now, if language is one of our primary technologies to access and share in the world, the terms and metaphors we use as interfaces for the planetary scale are not mere trivialities. So without the comforts embodied by this relative nearness of the horizon, of a discrete world remediated back to us in our own image, the big world demands perspectives that offer new vistas from which to invent markers of orientation. How we learn to see, hear, move, and communicate from within this big world requires we experiment with techniques for accessing its unfamiliar, often opaque, unknown dimensions, for making it experiential and therefore amenable to navigation at all. It is one thing to name this decentered human and planetary scale. These traffic very well in conferences. But it is quite another to exist in the consequences of those concepts meaningfully with material, relational, and gestural ramifications. So careful navigation at a planetary scale will be impossible with tools, language, concepts, and spatial figurations belonging only to the world of the discrete. The optimist realist in me sees this planetary scale as an opportunity to do away with one of the most pernicious myths that stands in the way of thinking from within a big world: the economic genre of being human and the destructive individualism it unleashes. That is not a world without relation, but one that only treats relations as vectors of exploitation. Thanks.
Thank you, Patricia. This was great. Next, I'd like to introduce Matteo Pasquinelli. The title of his talk will be The Emergence of Computational Geometry and the Automation of Perception. And Matteo is professor in media philosophy at the University of Arts and Design in Karlsruhe, where he is coordinating the research group on critical machine intelligence, KIM, K-I-M. He recently edited the anthology Alleys of Your Mind, Augmented Intelligence and Its Traumas on Maison Press, among other books. His research focuses on the intersection of cognitive sciences, digital economy, and machine intelligence. For Verso Books, he is preparing a monograph provisionally titled The Eye of the Master, Capital as Computation and Cognition. Please join me in welcoming Matteo Pasquinelli.
My slide, thank you. Thanks, I will try to pick up the torch of abstraction now from Patricia and continuing the mission. I would like also to thank, aside from Brian, Tom, Doreen, and Amal for this invitation, and you for being here in this very important Day for Berlin, because one of the most important political demonstrations is going on right now against gentrification and rent through Kreuzberg, but we are here to still discussing political issue. I was very impressed by yesterday, very beautiful lecturers we had, and I would like also to pick up the torch of fire that Hito left here. I have the feeling that the lecture was very interesting, but we got a bit lost in the Q&A in between Western's model of rationality and non-Western wilderness. And I think that I will try to reverse even probably what was Hito's historical exercise. Rather than trying to use AI to gesture towards some form of animism, I will try to show how actually ancient rituals, ancient non-Western rituals that we consider animistic, were actually highly complex form of mathematics and actually of algorithmic thinking. So I will move from this diagram, and I tell you the story that for me is very fascinating. It comes from the ancient Indian Veda scriptures, and it is a complex and intricate myth of cosmogenesis. In this myth is told that the creator of the universe, Prajapati, is shattered into pieces after the act of creation itself. That I found it very amusing. So the god, after composing the universe, is found himself dismembered. In the Agnikayana ritual, that is the reenaction of this myth, the devotees of Hinduism build a fire altar in the shape of a falcon by aligning bricks that step by step symbolically recompose the fragmented body of the god. So this fire altar is somehow, for me, is the complementary version of the fire that Ito was trying to simulate with neural networks last night. The construction of this altar executes a precise geometrical plan with thousands of bricks of precise size and shapes that lay down the final silhouette of a falcon. Each brick is consecrated and ordered by its dedicated mantra, and each layer of the altar is built on top of the previous one. Solving a logical exercise that is the key cipher of this ritual, solving a logical exercise that is the key cipher of this ritual, each layer is built keeping the same shape and area of the contiguous one, but employing a different configuration of bricks. The falcon altar must finally face east. In this case, the picture is reversed. Prelude to a symbolic flight of the reconstructed god towards the sun. Example of divine reincarnation by complex geometric means. The Agnikayana ritual is the testimony of a tradition of combinatorial geometry that dates back millennia. The ritual is described in the Shulba Sutras that were composed in India 3,000 years ago, but recording a much older tradition. If the art historian Willem Worringer argued that the primordial art was born by the gesture of the abstract line, we may add that also this art evolved by breaking the continuous line into segments and fractions, introducing geometrical technique of growing complexity. Still practiced in some parts of India, Agnikayana is probably one of the most ancient rituals of humankind and also a primordial example of algorithmic culture. What does it mean to define the Agnikayana ritual as algorithmic? In his book on the history of algorithms, the mathematician Jean-Luc Chabert has noted that, I quote, "Algorithms have been around since the beginning of time and existed well before a special word had been coined to describe them. Algorithms are simply a set of step-by-step instructions to carry out quite mechanically, so to achieve some desired result. Algorithms are not confined to mathematics. The Babylonians used them for deciding points of law, Latin teachers used them to get the grammar right, and they have been used in all culture for predicting the future, for deciding medical treatment, or for preparing food. We therefore speak of recipes, rules, techniques, processes, procedures, methods, using the same word to apply to different situations. The Chinese, for example, use the word shu, meaning rule, process, or stratagem for both mathematics and in martial arts. So algorithms are not the most recent and abstract techniques as we usually think, but on the contrary, among the most ancient and the most concrete ones, predating tools and machines and even grammars, mythologies, and I would say the mathematics itself. So algorithms came before mathematics. It is not necessary here to repeat that the word algorithm comes from the name of the Persian scholar Al-Khwarizmi. And in general, focusing on the work of Al-Khwarizmi, we can define 3 stages in the history of algorithm. In the ancient time, the algorithm was simply a procedure or a codified ritual to achieve a specific goal. In the Middle Age, thanks to the work of Al-Khwarizmi, the algorithm was a procedure to assist calculation, also by hand calculation. And in contemporary times, the algorithm, qua mathematical operation, got completely and fully automated in digital computers. Today, in the age of digital computation and artificial intelligence, there is this tendency to perceive the algorithm as the application of a mathematical ideas and formula in the abstract on concrete data. And I would like here to reverse this perception and to show that computation actually is an emergent process that historically moves from below. We used to say, using this kind of orientation, that moves from material practices and mundane techniques, from a division of space, time, and labor. So computation evolves gradually from concrete towards abstract forms, we can say, simplifying somehow. As great historians of science like Simon Scheffer and Lorraine Dustin have shown more recently, the history of artificial intelligence is the history of automation of a very mundane division of labor, rather than the dream, for instance, to build super intelligent automata or thinking automata. So fast forward 3,000 years. In 1957, at the Cornell Aeronautical Laboratory in Buffalo, New York, the cognitive scientist Frank Rosenblatt invented and constructed the perceptron, the first operative artificial neural network. The first prototype of the perceptron was an analog computer, not a digital one. It was made just of wires connecting potentiometers, photoreceptors, and light bulbs in what they look like cybernetic feedback loops. The perceptron was basically a network of artificial neurons connecting an input device called retina to a single output, a light bulb that could turn on and off. The retina of the perceptron was composed by a small matrix of 20 per 20 photoreceptors in order to detect and classify simple shapes such as letters or triangles. The perceptron was the first algorithm of machine learning and represented the basic binary classifier. It means that it could simply say if a pattern was falling within a specific class or not. And at the beginning was used, for instance, to check if a triangle was a triangle or not, a square or not, and also, interesting, a woman or not, a man or not in the first experiments. In other words, the perceptron was constructing the function that could decide whether or not an input represented by a spatial matrix of numbers belonged to a specific class. It was not invented to recognize patterns, I'm not going into details here, but to learn how to recognize potentially any pattern. The first perceptron, of course, like today, neural network, was trained by a human operator answering correctly at the beginning, giving the correct answer to the machine with the hope that the machine will then guess future shapes correctly in the future. So the automation of perception, the industrialization of vision or visionics, this is also central in the discussion here about navigation and navigation technique. This automation of perception that Paul Virilio, Willem Flusser, and Harun Farocki discuss in different terms in their different works is key to understand today also genealogy of artificial intelligence. Yann LeCun, that is the godfather of convolutional neural networks and today boss of AI at Facebook, has repeated and keeps on reminding that what people call AI is basically a sophisticated form of pattern recognition that is a form of perception rather than cognition. This genealogy requires more time, but I'm not going into there. I would like to focus only on this matrix, this beginning of the history of machine learning, of neural networks, was a spatial matrix of 20 per 20 photoreceptors. And this is the beginning of a silent revolution in computer science that will finally emerge 50 years later, half a century later with the rise of the paradigm of deep learning, with the rise of the paradigm of deep learning that we know today. From the logical point of view, this is interesting for me because is a topological turn, is a spatial twist. It is the introduction of a spatial dimension, a second spatial dimension, into a paradigm of computation that until then maintained only one linear dimension. So with neural networks, with machine learning, we have the introduction of a second dimension, maybe potentially a third, and so on. So when people ask how artificial intelligence works, we know how it works a bit and actually started in this way. The silent revolution of machine learning could be described also in this way. Rather than having an algorithm applying top-down rules on data, data start to provide rules for their own computation. That means that data themselves start to build the algorithm for their computation, bottom-up. This could be framed as the passage from the model of passive information to the idea of active information. That is the intuition behind machine learning. But according to which logic are data supposed to give rules for their own computation? Rather than having information of a visual matrix, for instance, being processed by a complex top-down algorithm like could be any Photoshop filter today, the disposition itself of the pixel in the visual matrix dictate the rules for their own computation. This model is called computational space, computational geometry, computational topology, and it's basically space computing itself. So in order to understand the meaning of expressions such as automation of perception, industrialization of vision, used by both Virilio and Farocki, we have to consider this idea of computational space, self-computing space. Also, when people ask about how AI works, we have to consider this at the base of machine learning. And we can already start to make some reflection about about this genealogy. This idea of self-computing space, I will try to show at the end if I have enough time, is the utopia of automation. It's the idea that the landscape dictates the rules of its own navigation, like the landscape produces a map of itself autonomously, automatically. It's clearly an utopia, an industrial utopia. This is a utopia, indeed, of a territory that produces its map. But this is actually what is happening today with self-driving cars. The territory produces a map of its own navigation, and the human point of view becomes somehow secondary and useless. But I'm not sure it's really so. There are historical examples of self-computing spaces. I don't have time to go into them, but all these ideas emerging between the 50s and the 60s, and you can take also the idea of cellular automata by John von Neumann, or the idea of rechnende Raum by Karl Zuse. The cellular automata, probably you're familiar, you find them on the left top angle. They were made of these cells or construction of cells. They were like evolving according to some logic rules embedded into the matrix, not receiving, so to speak, instruction from the outside and being used to simulate evolution. Karl Zuse thought to apply this idea of the cellular automata to the whole universe, devising this idea of digital physics. So the universe itself is a gigantic computer made of atoms, self-computing themselves. But also Alan Turing, last essays, the chemical basis of morphogenesis is based on this idea of self-computing structures. And one even could mention the book that actually killed the project of neural networks at the beginning and started the winter of artificial intelligence. This book by Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert called Perceptrons that actually was subtitled An Introduction to Computational Geometry. So the perceptron, interestingly enough, was named by Rosenblatt, a perceiving automaton. And this idea inspired also Virilio's book, The Vision Machine, especially the 5th chapter, that will be also crucial for Farocki to sketch the idea of operational image. And so Virilio in 1989 wrote something very prophetic, because in 1989 nobody would predict that actually the model of connectionism would become so powerful and hegemonic all over the planet. And I read this quote that is indeed from the 5th chapter of The Vision Machine. You probably are very familiar here with this quote because it starts with the famous quote of Paul Klee, "Now objects perceive me." "Now objects perceive me," the painter Paul Klee wrote in his notebooks. This rather startling assertion has recently become objective fact, the truth. After all, aren't they talking about producing a vision machine in the near future, a machine that will be capable not only of recognizing the contours of shape, but also of completely interpreting the visual field? Aren't they talking about new technologies, the new technology of visionics, the possibility of achieving sightless vision, whereby the video camera would be controlled by a computer? Such technology would be used in industrial production and stock control, in military robotics too, perhaps. Now that they are preparing the way for the automation of perception, Virilio continues, for the innovation of artificial vision, delegating the analysis of objective reality to a machine, it might be appropriate to have another look at the nature of the virtual image. Today, it is impossible to talk about the development of the audiovisual without pointing to the new industrialization of vision, to the growth of a veritable market in synthetic perception and all the ethical questions all the ethical question this entails. Don't forget, the whole idea behind the perceptron would be to encourage the emergence of fifth-generation expert systems. In other words, an artificial intelligence that could be further enriched only by acquiring organs of perception. So, there is an incredible historical gap between Agnicayana as a ritual and the perceptron. But here, of course, I propose it as a provocation to show the continuity of algorithmic logic, of an algorithmic culture between ancient and contemporary technique. So rather than showing, as I said before, a kind of animistic core within contemporary AI, it will be equally interesting to show how an AI core within ancient mathematics and rituals. So both the Agnicayana ritual and machine learning are examples of emergent algorithms. They emerge from and replace a political division of space, time, and labor, a division of the social space. They emerge from and replace a territory of human bodies and social relations that we know is also crossed by tensions and conflicts, by bias and exploitation. Both the Agnicayana ritual and machine learning as computational geometry emerge from grids that continue the tradition of ancient abstraction and rituals, of counting people and goods, of marking bodies and territories. The idea of self-computing space, that I try to sketch here, of self-computing image, is central to the history of AI and represent the utopia for industrial automation. As I just mentioned, in the case of self-driving cars, it's like having a landscape that dictates the rule of its own navigation. It's the utopia of a territory that produces automatically its own map. And this is precisely what is happening in the machine learning system of self-driving car. Human point of view becomes secondary and useless, but it's really so. Machine learning composes a final unity that appears to remain fragile, fragmented, and highly statistical, as we can see in all the cases of machine learning errors and self-driving cars accidents. And actually has also a directive of the Bundestag that curiously, the Bundestag is a few meters from here, as you know. As a directive of the Bundestag has noticed a few weeks ago, artificial intelligence is a fragile and vulnerable paradigm. They don't say fragile, but they say that artificial intelligence is a vulnerable paradigm in this document. And this vulnerable paradigm needs large process of validation. So it means that neural networks are never free from errors, and human being workers, they've always come entering and fix these errors and continues validating this statistical model. This is done by an incredible and invisible chain of division of labor that extend actually in the global south. So the validation of German AI system, part of the training of neural networks, to do image detection also for self-driving cars, is done by workers in South America, in India, but also in Italy and in Spain today. And it's interesting how German is indeed outsourcing these cheap jobs outside the country. In this utopia of automation, in which the territory computes its own navigation map, the task of abstraction is to reveal also the map of the division of labor that is continuously rendered invisible, to reveal the historical forces, the territories of power and conflicts behind the construction of any algorithm. As the great historian of science, Simon Scheffer, has said, we can paraphrase him, to make machines, to make self-driving cars look intelligent, it is necessary that the source of their power, the labor force which surround and run them, is rendered invisible. Thank you.
Thank you, Matteo. For our final presentation, in this panel, I'd like to introduce Ramon Amaro, who the title of his talk is Abstract Blackness, Absolute Value. Ramon is a lecturer in the Department of Visual Cultures at Goldsmiths, University of London, as well as in the Center for Research Architecture. Previously, he was research fellow in digital culture at Het Nooy Institute in Rotterdam and visiting tutor in media theory at the Royal Academy of Art in The Hague. He has worked as an assistant editor for the Sage Open Access journal, Big Data and Society, quality design engineer for General Motors, and programs manager for the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. His research interests include machine learning, design engineering, black ontology, and philosophies of being. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ramon Amaro.
Thank you for that introduction. I would also like to thank the organizers of this conference. It's really my pleasure to be here, especially to share a stage, especially with Patricia and Matteo, who I have just a world of respect for and admiration. So it's really a pleasure to actually interact with these wonderful individuals. And actually, thank you all for being here. This is not easy after lunch, right? Do all this. It's a new rule, totalitarian rule, no philosophy after lunch, please. Yes. So really what I want to do is pick up on the themes that we have been discussing over the last 2 days and thinking about these sort of meditations on the role of mathematics, especially with this idea of a spatial temporal organization, both of our social and our individual senses of being. So in a way, the reflections I'm going to speak on now are a reflection about calculus. And by calculus, I refer to the determination or the quantity of something, or more so the means to assess the effects or possibilities of a course of action, or as I will argue, a process by which calculus becomes the instrument of mediation between living beings in communication with machines and other humans. But this system of reasoning, I argue, enacts as well a domain of the absolute and is entangled with the functional summation of infinitesimal human differences. But rather than viewing and therefore opening up these differences as a process of emergence, and I think we've been dealing with this for the last day and a half so far, in the building of an individual or collective self, calculus instead forms a hard mass around the arrival of difference in the social milieu. In doing so, calculus as a process through which the logics of enumeration materialize blurs any distinction between the creation, renewal, beginning, and returning of the self, as Karen Berard might articulate it, and the absolute action of numerical predeterminacy. In other words, to calculate is not simply a matter of figuring, estimation, or symbolic representation. Calculus is actionable in the sense that it brings forward expression that forces the discourses that form around the structures of, in my argument here, race, to confront the conditions of their possibilities. In other words, calculus does not simply reveal single instances of social inequality or the arresting of social relations. It reveals the very conditions that make these violences possible. While this position might appear to reduce calculus to mediation through the ordering of a multivalent set of relational distinctions, it is, as I argue following Simondon, a language that reveals the operative nature of race and racialization, but not as an exploitative mechanism, and we'll talk about this later, I want to think underneath the exploitative mechanism. And in a way, what I'm presenting to you here is almost a reverse engineering of a sociological project. But due to time, I've actually reversed that. So if we have time, I'll talk to you about the project. Yeah, you see how much I respect sociology. But I don't want to look at this as a sort of exploitative mechanism, but instead something that reveals the existing consistencies of exploration. Or in other words, I want to explore machine learning as instead the necessary condition for transformation and transmutation itself. I resist the dismissal of language as an innate instrument disconnected from its operative reality. Whether that language be computational code, symbolic mathematics, social custom, or in this case, the colonial rhetoric. Instead, I want to prioritize language as instead, quote, action, as offense, and as seduction, quoting Simondon, that while it may rest in the domain of the seemingly absolute or outright totalitarian view of the world, also brings to visibility what is less considered, and that is the collective nurturing of the imaginary absolute as the basis of justification, judgment, and expression. This, what Sylvia Wynter might call the substance of race. However, as Wynter has argued, even as race restructures itself in the everyday as a recurrent cycle by ignoring what Simondon describes as the voices of silence, it remains operative as an integral part of collective perspective, as well as the collective understanding of self, what Wynter has termed the bioepisteme. So Wynter's, of course, picking up on Fanon and Foucault here and thinking through actually the recurrent cycle of alienation and desire that itself is self-dependent upon its own alienation. That is actually divorced from any concept of affirmative being, but relies upon an epistemic materialization of that conflict in itself to actually enact the next transformation. So philosophically confused here. So basically, when we saw yesterday afternoon thinking about how the algorithmic might actually mirror the divine, that's basically what Wynter is picking up on and thinking about, as Patricia was saying, this sort of divorcing from the divine into this mechanism of humanism, the replacing of the divine by the fictive sense of man. And now that the fictive sense of man is under attack, it's being replaced. There must be a ceremony. The ceremony must be found. That's basically what Wynter is saying. And this, what David Scott more eloquently describes as a mediation between the subject to its milieu, and the milieu being the convergence of a particular set of forces that materialize into a single expression. I like how Patricia sort of termed this, and I'm going to try to find it. I like it, totality of compounded effects. Can I borrow that? I promise I'll cite you. Thanks. Yeah, I'm going to borrow that. But this idea that this convergence of this particular set is, as Scott posits, quote, equally communicated with every word and what murmurs within it and is borne by it. Those tensions it subsumes, rehearses, and forms through the transformation of information into signification. In this case, the signification of race and the interpolation of the individual. And here's how I'm trying to make a connection between Fanon and Wynter and Simondon, who makes it very apparent, and what we know from computer science is that we conflate the terms of data and information. They are not the same. Information is the coherence of a pattern of data. And what I'm thinking about is the thesis that Fanon and Wynter set up, is that any form of difference that appears to be coherent is already predicated on its existing fragmentation. And this is how Fanon basically says, once you're interpolated, that's when it actually comes into coherence. And we know this from data, right? You are fragmented already. As soon as you're needed for an operative mode of capitalism, then you come into coherence as a cat lover, as a video lover, so on and so forth. So in this case, when we think about the interpolation of the individual, it takes on different types of meanings. And this is something that Fanon had already put forward during his own interpolation. Look, a Negro, as he illustrates. or as we know today in terms of surveillance, look, sir or madam, a suspect. And as we know in the engineering community, you can throw apples at me later, look, it's just mathematics. While one, in the case of Fanon, mediates the imperial subject through the technologies of the colonial episteme, the other mediates the contemporary racialized subject through the reduction of machine learning to a mere language of description. What I suggest is that they both make oblique reference to the image of the racialized being, which is used even unwittingly to announce the presence of a particular type of human. This interpolation furthermore enacts a doubleness of expression, one that excludes and ranks, and another that attempts to provoke, or should I say nurture, any present or future encounter with the problem of race. And this is something that Fanon already said in the cycle of desire. This is sort of his remix from the Hegelian master-slave dialectic. And we know from the Hegelian master-slave dialectic, there becomes a circular cycle where the master actually depends upon the subjection of the slave, and the slave actually depends upon the dominance of the master. Fanon, of course, takes that into another realm to think about the subjected body as opposed to a body of dominance. And what I'm attempting to do here is bring that into the realm of machine learning to possibly explain our equal anxiety with machine learning and data and our equal desire for it. Because it's quite simple, we could just turn it off. And in this way, given this idea and what I'm attempting to illustrate thus far, this totalizing, I don't know where I made that word up. You know, ever since I entered academia, now I can make up words. It happens all the time. Yeah, the totalizing perception of the racialized being links the problem of race with the problem of language, which is furthermore distributed or communicated through the technical object or apparatus. We have seen this ever more readily in discursive challenges to racialization and other forms of algorithmic discrimination. And I won't go into these particular examples. I think we're all aware of the potential problems here. For now, however, I want to talk about how it is a space, how it's safe to say then that this image, this perception of the black being, the black subject, at once, as Simondon argues, provokes individual action and synchronizes collective behavior, while according to Scott, quote, excluding and identifying in order to distance oneself from the stranger, the deviant, the other. This other is the trans-individual image that is the bearer of a reality that is both psychic and social. So thinking about a way to pick up actually on the two presentations that were sent before, how these mechanisms actually become fundamentally necessary to not only understand their spatial temporal organization of the world, as Kara Keeling would say, but also understand difference in itself within that matrix of the spatial temporal organization. And in this way, what I want to do is draw attention to this problematic as an act. It's not a description, as a co-productive, parasitic, symbiotic act through which, as Fanon has argued, the problem of race becomes a problem of ontology. Although Fanon's comments on technology are limited, I want to think here at the ontological, at the event, the Simondonian event, that makes visible that which evades definitive materialization, such as the substance of race and the oppression of data. The event which can be characterized only as a discomforting confrontation between partisan points of view that seek at once to rid themselves of the alienation that emerges at the encounter of difference. This phenomenon is exacerbated by leaving each other as well as the self exposed to the symbol of race. So basically what Simondon is saying, and this is also what Fanon has said very interestingly in terms of race, is again this dynamic itself, that a function of the desire to be with the discomfort of the dynamic is to reveal the discomfort for the next stage of action. But we keep missing the point. That's why Fanon couldn't get to his new humanism, because the cycle kept going. He was saying the purpose of the cycle was to actually get out of the cycle. So in this way, I seek to highlight the function of enumeration as that which makes the desire for individual and collective coherence, and therefore control, actionable, in a sense that any notion of dynamism that might compose the me, the you, the I, the we, the us, is set aside in favor of a statistical reconstruction of the wonderful traces that me, you, I, we, us leave behind. And think about desires to capture and sort these forms of self, how they're forecasted onto alternative grids of relation that form new socio-technical political hierarchies, while simultaneously flattening what could perhaps be described as the absolute value of life, more so a Fred Moten value of life, a generative value of life that both takes a vested interest in representation, but an equal indifference to it as well. And in this way, the object of machine learning, the object of artificial intelligence, pattern recognition, I mean, it's a ton of data-dependent types of technologies. They emerge as the new lens through which any actions in the social are validated. To the extent that our individual and collective encounters within these systems extend well beyond notions of design, ease of use, or individualized suggestions. They take on new meaning if we consider how the underlying principles of language, digital language, or the codes of what I've argued is the black technical object emerge. With this ontological starting point, we are faced with a rearticulation of the conception of race, the black body, machine learning, and our perceptions of the world around us. In other words, we must break the myth that it is only machine learning that uses a rudimentary set of tools to try to make sense of the world. We ourselves are structurally responsible for the generalizable and objectively necessary judgments of each other. If machine learning orients the human individual in relation to the data and information around us, then machine learning also mediates our contemporary necessity to grasp the unknown and the unknowable. In other words, machine learning can be seen not as a technology, but as an intensification of existing desires to grasp the nature of being by contesting the limits of our own perception. In terms of machine learning, we have barely scratched the surface of our desire to illuminate and amplify the pre-existing distances between each other, ourselves, and the dynamic world. Put another way, machine learning is not a crisis of artificiality or automation or transparency, but perhaps a crisis of the self that is at present perceptive of that which is only understood in the world in terms of either exclusion or belonging, whether that exclusion or belonging be human, machine, coder, non-coder, black, white, etc., so on and so forth. But this isn't all grim news. If machine learning is the mediator of these existing tensions, then the realm of resistance to the perceived self as well as the perceived milieu can bring forth a political project. To challenge the problem of machine learning, race, and data, we must embark on a fundamental revaluation of the values that form our individual and collective perceptions. And I think it was someone said yesterday too, maybe perhaps computer science here is our friend, garbage in, garbage out. And I think we forget about the actionable implications of that, which is we can always change the type of garbage. And in this way, I'm thinking through here, I want to argue that machine learning articulates, in this sense, its own genealogy and computational logics that necessitate a reformulation of human relationships with data. It does not articulate data as either discrete or in between discreteness. Instead, machine learning operates within the capacity of its own computational reason, where data can either be discrete or in the process of discretization, or both. And again, that's what Fanon is saying, is fundamentally concerned not only with the particular racialized body, but the relation between that particular and the universal of this elusive thing called race. And one goal here is to understand how the black body operates at this intersection of history, within this modulation of history, or as Ansel Duo would say, these borderland. And how it enacts in itself a speculative technique that is already infused with the everyday recurrent actions of anxiety and desire. And it is here at the junction of encounter and experience that Guattari views the racialized group as assigning meaning. This meaning is a force that, quote, constitutes the seeds of the production of subjectivity. As, quote, we are not the presence of a passively representative image, but a vector of subjectification. I tried to do it again, you saw that. It is through the meaning of blackness that the black, brown, and racialized individual creates a cohesion of misrepresentation, expounded by aesthetic markers, dynamic vibrations, and cultural kineticisms that are often expressed as a sense of belonging, which is dependent upon an inherent disbelonging. So as Fred Moten says, I'll summarize here very badly, if the black can only be black in relationship to white, is there anything called a black social life? So really what I'm picking up on is the tools that we need to subvert our own discomfort with machine learning is already present within the discomfort we've imposed on bodies of difference in the world. So in the Spivakian terms, can the subaltern speak? Because they have the solution. So if we think of this type of reality, this type of spatial temporal order in this sense, as a continual process of this type of transformation, only ever comprised of indeterminable modulations between a coherence and incoherence of ourselves and the world, then perhaps what at first might appear to be a rudimentary field of perception enacted by the machine is in fact the reorientation we desire to help us establish a new, more equitable type of planetary relation. However, this will happen only if we are willing to reorient our own perceptions and set the technical object free. Oh, thank you. Oh, how am I on time? Are we off? We're out of time. Yeah, I have just one more, the reverse engineering part. So basically, my project started as sort of I don't know why this says abstract, it's weird. Started as sort of a project, a sociological project with a young man named Yumi, who's a part of a punk band, Breathing Light, and it all stems from this quote here where it says, being a black punk is like a weird effing experience, feeling. To be more specific, it's like weird as hell. It's weird when you are at a show that some of your white friends invited you to, but you really can't tell if some of the bands in the bill are white power, so on and so forth. The conversations that I had with Yumi, and this is coming out in the article soon, the conversation I had with Yumi was basically, Yumi performs modulation of experience and transformation through duress. At the time, Yumi attended a predominantly black college. He comes from a family of punk music lovers, so he has the full punk aesthetic. He told me that most of the people on his uni campus had more of an R&B hip-hop aesthetic, so he was already bullied and othered. He was into the punk scene, so he would go to a nearby punk club and again would encounter this type of exclusion where he aesthetically fit, but his phenotype didn't fit, and that's when he would encounter white power. So basically, each time he entered into a space is when it materialized. So white power didn't exist until he entered the punk club. Right? And the stereotype of blackness didn't exist until he went on campus. But this was the most interesting part, which actually set off my meditation with this, is what Yumi would do is he said that when he is in the punk club, the only way that he could subvert the duress of white power was to pretend like he was the stereotype of the black campus. And then the only way he could navigate over the bullying on the black campus was to pretend like he was in the mosh pit of the punk club. So he basically self-modulates, which is exactly what I'm sort of proposing and arguing that we are already inherently capable of. And then now we have this technological apparatus which can do the same. So let's let it do something other than organize email, right? So here we go. Thank you very much.
Thank you guys so much for these three wonderful presentations. I think we have about 25 minutes or so for a brief discussion and then questions from the audience, so prepare your questions. One thing that I thought about through all of your talks was this kind of strange phenomenon that I think that I have seen happening in the U.S., which is the results of kind of like consumer grade DNA testing, right? Where you receive these test results back. And I don't want to ask this question. It's not really so much a question of concerning European race science. It's more a question of a profound new form of really interpolation of the self historically, but also terrestrially, right? Or also how is the self to be understood as a historical being in time? But the condition for understanding the self is to first see oneself as metadata. No, it's really a conversion of one's own self-understanding as a historical creature through metadata. I think it's incredibly interesting because it is so seductive. It's so seductive. Consumer grade. So we're talking really just regular people, for maybe around $100 or something, you can get a DNA test. You spit into a bottle, you send it out. I have not done it. I would kind of like to. I find it terrifying, but also a part of another another system of kind of almost you could even think of it as a part of a larger tendency towards kind of like reverse diaspora, right? A kind of a consciousness where you understand yourself, and your historical constitution. Not so much in terms of the education system that you had, the place where you grew up, but through much longer and larger and cross locally arrangements, right? So you usually, I think you get a test back with this strange kind of almost like radioactive clouds, like very brightly colored kind of radioactive clouds on different parts of the earth, telling you, kind of approximating which group you might probably belong to. You might probably only belong to, right? But the kind of epistemological power of this is incredible. It is data, but it is also oneself. And it can redistribute your sense of belonging in a profound way.
Is the self reducible to a DNA test? I would just have a problem to equate selfhood and a DNA. Because I haven't thought about this. You mentioned you're going to do this, and I started to freak out in the seat, so I started to think about how to answer. But what I'm worried about is the motivation for this curiosity. Yes, it's curious, but I don't know if I'm remembering this TV ad. There was like an Anglo TV ad, maybe even a British thing or something, where basically there was a bunch of people from various backgrounds, various geographies, and people were getting test results, and you get these like proud white dudes that were like, I knew I'm 100% Scottish, and then they find out that they're like tainted by, I don't know, Indian blood or something. But then because of that, then all of a sudden they're like not racist anymore if they were, and I'm thinking, well, what kind of, no, but I'm not trying to make light of it, because it basically, is meaning that the only way you would not be having these negative relations to others, as you were saying in your talk, was because there would be something comes in your head about some mode of familiarity. So that would be the genetic linkage or something. Whereas why wouldn't the default mode just be that anyways? Why would you need that? And so I'm quite concerned about that. Even, I mean, of course it would be curious to know where your, body, the historical traces of your body, but I am very worried about the motivations for it, and then also this painting it in this beautiful light, like, oh, we're actually composed of all these different things, now we can get along. Well, why couldn't we get along in the first place? Why did we need that genetic bond? That's why I would think we need more work on a social level.
Just this is an example of the inability to modulate this data, as Ramon was suggesting. So I guess it's pretty fixed, this matrix of gene you can play with. And this is a way basically sometimes also to block your identity, the identity of your family. So there's no modulation of data. There is no a reappropriation of what would be data analytics here. It would be actually opposite example of what also Ramon, we were referring to, the fact that we should refuse to be consider ourselves subject to machine learning. We should refuse to construct ourselves this form of subject and start to play, to modulate back this sort of matrix. But I'm wondering if white supremacists do this DNA test, because they're all statistical stuff coming out completely random and messy. So they keep it secret. They do it, but they keep it secret, right? White supremacists, because they don't mention it on any blog,
But this is the thing, is that
on
the
Reddit,
white,
you don't find 4chan, you don't see any white supremacist that did the DNA
also maybe
test.
the white supremacist discovers that he is actually Indian and Chinese.
Yes,
No?
But I think this is what I'm trying to think through, as that necessary condition, as this test actually being a necessary condition. And I'm trying to think through that again, thinking about Fanon's, autobiographical account. Because, when Fanon first started that project, he basically wanted his money back. He thought he was French. Yeah. He got duped. He's like, wait, I followed the code. And the code was very explicit about what being a French subject meant. And he followed that path, and then he was interpolated on the train, which he couldn't process. He couldn't actually assign any type of malignant intent because it was a child. And that's when he was starting to realize that, no, actually, this is in the air. It's infused. It's actually a part of, we're both breathing the same air, and we have very different perceptions of what's objectified in the world. And of course, Simondon's saying that's the problematic Simondon's making, is how do we actually exist in the same space, but have a different encounter with the same events? And so when I think about these sort of DNA tests, I'm fascinated by the surprise, because then it's the surprise. I guess that's what I'm saying, is these things illuminate the anxiety, because it's in the surprise where you realize that the dissonance between their forms of perception and actually how they can exist in the same particular type of space. Even if we use something as reductive as phenotype. Right? So you have a family who have darker hues who take a DNA test and are surprised that they have some relationship to people in the global south. Why you look in the mirror every day? It's there already waiting to be accessed, but it can't be accessed because the prevalent perception is so dominant that it enacts its own impossibility for perception. So a mechanism has to be created either to prevent it or reveal it. So it's basically either put it in the closet or bring it out, and so you can take no accountability, because it's the DNA test that said it, not your cousin. Exactly. Right? Yes, and it's more comfortable in that sense if this objective scientific test says it than my parent or me or something else, because those have different implications.
Right. Yeah, it's extremely powerful, I think. Also, as it's an empirical, in its empiricism. but then also in its role as data. This is so. I'm not thinking of this as also. I'm not thinking of this as something. Well, it's terrifying in its significance, because it also does manage to redistribute senses of belonging beyond, and sort of encourage senses of belonging that go beyond. Institutions of nation and empire, so long as you subscribe to them.
But they have, I mean, just to kind of reuse one of the important terms you had in your talk. I mean, maybe I've been saying it wrong all the time. I was like episteme. I was like, oh, episteme, okay.
I make up words. I told you already.
Or like the episteme, the cosmology. But like, to me, what is problematic about it is that it's very much bound to a notion of bond through genetics. Right? Whereas I thought part of the struggle was to kind of redefine what kinship bonds would be, or however you wanted to do it. And that, to me, this kind of, I get very nervous. I'm not even German, but I live here. And as a North American, it's still shocking to me, this like blood and soil connection, because I don't come from that background, and it's, I want to do away with it, absolutely. Yeah.
And I think in a sense, that's why I'm also attracted to Winter and this idea, because, I mean, if you think about the implications of eradicating the divine, of unraveling that myth, and then the implications, because all of that relation could then be put into this fictive sense of man. So I only understand myself in relationship to this fictive prototype, as Gordon would say. And then to have that in the contemporary be dismantled. And I'm almost wondering, and I still need to think a lot through this, if what we're actually seeking is the ceremony within ourselves. So it actually is not a hypocrisy. It actually is a part of the understanding that mirrors itself as nationalism, that mirrors itself as resistance, but it's really trying a reconciliation, but a lazy reconciliation. Yeah. Right? So I don't want to do all the work. I do part of the work, and it's like, oh, that's like that community, right? Yeah. And then, the ceremony is in that fascist group when it's not. Right. Which, of course, is going to put us back in the same recurrent type of cycle.
Right, almost like a taxonomic relation.
Basically. Oh. Yeah, the divine failed me as a taxonomy, so now taxonomy won't fail me again. Yeah, that's basically what I'm trying to think. It could be total nonsense. I'm curious to hear what you say.
Did you have?
No, but you said something interesting. This is a form of identity that's recognized to you, not by the state, by a corporation. And there's this sense of belonging that actually, of course, we're looking at these genetic maps. We saw actually today these maps of migration that were very interesting, by Lopresti. And so it's also a way to modulate by a corporation, by a capitalistic system, our sense of belonging through the globe. So I see as a new form of post-state identity modulation of our movement and belonging. So,
and I just kind of think in that in that way, I think is also why feminism and even Black feminism has really, they've been in this sort of space for a while of thinking about how duress has forced community, has forced an innate communal ability. So if we think about colonialism and slavery, it actually enforced a communal sense of belonging. I think it's the same thing with homophobia, misogyny. It forces a community of belonging, which in itself relies upon the episteme or episteme, whatever you call it, a series of tools to enact, to navigate through that duress. Yeah. So in a way, it's only those that perceive themselves outside of the duress that are actually in crises, because the ones in crises already have the tools because they've been in crises. So it's something like, I remember a few years ago during the 2008 crises, the financial thing, and Chris Rock, the comedian, was being interviewed by Larry King before he retired, and Larry is like all serious, and he's like, Chris, so how are you doing? He's talking about money, like, are you surviving? And Chris Rock laughed, and he said, I'm fine, but if you had my kind of money, you would jump off a bridge. And there's so much in that about perception and perspective and thinking about actually what the threshold in this sort of topic we're talking about, how the threshold actually is aligned with perception, but in terms of resistance, we keep treating that threshold as if it's the same. And it's not, which means we'll never get past this anxiety with the machine because the thresholds are all over the place.
Questions from the audience? I think we have time for maybe 3 or so. Angeli?
Those were such amazing presentations. I'm going to completely blow it and not be able to say what I really want to say. But I was talking with Ramon about being an idiot yesterday and how important that is against kind of smartness and smart production of art and smart production of knowledge, which is inherently colonial. So I was thinking when Matteo is speaking about time a lot in relation to Advaita Vedanta philosophy in Hinduism, and not in Hinduism, in Hindu philosophy. And I was thinking a lot about the gamelan orchestra in relation to this complete auditory relationship to time, where you're just listening to everything at once. You're listening to the full spatial. You can, apprehend time in relation to the audible, but
Can you just say the name of the orchestra again?
This gamelan orchestra from Indonesia. It's not. But I was just thinking about the Advaita Vedanta philosophy in relation to, this total oneness that through meditation of the senses, turning the senses inward, we can experience the universe. So this idea that and then break it again, if you like. So you have to continually break it in order to see it again and break it. So that's why there's all these millions of gods always appearing and reappearing and doing all these really complex things. And then I was thinking with Patricia, your talk about this localization and this complex, how one retains a complexity. I was thinking about, I was talking with Brian about it last night, isn't it the rights of nature that will set us into a more complex relationship with where we are? If every aspect of life apart from us has rights, at least that's a start in relation to the violence and the epistemological violence that Ramon was kind of talking about as well, in a way. So I was thinking, how do we stop the idea of the local becoming about nativism or nationalism, and think about other forms of life that has rights? And then just with Ramon, I just wanted to say that the idea of self-modulation, as you described, thank you for your amazing talk. It was just really inspiring, but and you talk about the algorithm becoming divine. I was thinking about this idea of resistant aesthetics, like how to create a resistant aesthetic against the white savior, against the white desire to disidentify, in order to get closer to blackness, so they can feel more like liberated or emancipated, which is not what one wants to break the category in order to distance oneself from the very thing that wants one dead, right? So how does one, in a way, self-modulate in relation to creating this kind of resistant aesthetic? I think you were beginning to get into it in relation to black feminism. I'll stop there.
No, thanks for your remarks. I mean, I kind of really am interested in this. I mean, there wasn't enough time, and I have to do a lot more work on this to pursue this path. But ultimately, I would be a bit nervous. I'm a bit wary because this campaign exists. It's admirable about applying legal. Human legal norms to objects and natural phenomena, like a river can be naturally protected and so on and so forth. But I'm a little bit wary of introducing these things already into kind of an anthropomorphic frame. I'm not, I think, I mean, again, I appreciate the immediate application of that strategy, but I don't think it's some kind of long-term thing. And I know that we are talking about various different timescales, and there's degrees of acuteness that things need to be answered to now, and arguably what I'm talking about is a longer-term epistemic transformation, cosmological transformation. What I'm personally invested in is this, the spatial ramifications of the extra-local, precisely because there is something like geometry that we tend to think of as a bit abstract, outside of ourselves, something you do with a compass when you're in high school or something, but a little bit disconnected from the realm of gestures and so on. There's loads of arguments, like Giuseppe Longo is a theorist who thinks about this, about a direct linkage towards phenomenology and geometry. And I think it's very important that, when the humanist human was invented, it had a corresponding geometry. So there was a tool and there was a concept, and it was getting reinforced. Because we need to talk about uptake. If you want something to change, things need to have a mode of uptake, which means through tools, through reproducibility, and so on. So what would be a new geometry that could be experienced, that could allow for a mode of reproducibility for humans to self-understand in that particular mode? So although it is a little bit abstract, I think given the force that the humanist human had, I think it's like not an entirely sorry, I'm a bit foggy. There's something to learn from that success, if you want to say. So I'm kind of interested in that, but it is going to be a very long-term research, because the mathematics is not something you can learn yourself. You need to work with people who understand those, like the Grothendiekian stuff that I was talking about is very over the top.
I would like to say something on Grothendieck, and to demystify some kind of fetish for ancient rituals. What is interesting in the Agnikayana ritual is the fact that in terms of politics of geometry, is also a kind of symbol for a paradigm of power, of control, because it's actually the one exercise to express the many within the border of the one. So this is like the old riddle of power, through any continent, through, not just the Western forms of politics, but, here in the West, exemplified by Hobbes, discussed by Spinoza, but how you express the many through the one, and vice versa, how you control the many through the one. But Patricia, going to this, back to this role of geometry in politics, I would say that indeed politics has been always historically connected to geometry, but we have to clarify the genesis of geometry and which geometrical school, which school of mathematics. And the way I see the fact that any form of thought, any theory of number that we discussed with Brian a few times, actually comes from, indeed, mundane practice, sometimes unconscious rituals, whatever. And this has been a domain that's been already revealed by ethnomathematics only recently. And then on top of that, what we build on top of that is not mathematics, it's algorithmics. They're like technical practices without theory, indeed done even without our Western obsession for rationality. And you see this technique, this algorithm, I call it algorithmics, all over the globe. Then on top of these techniques, we develop the theory of numbers, the theory of form, that is geometry and mathematics. And on top of that, we develop the ideology of mathematics and numbers, that is numerology sometimes, when even the ancient Pythagoreans, they thought they could, they wanted to reorganize the society according to the numerical base proportion found also in the musical instrument. So when we touch sciences, and specifically mathematics and geometry, there is often a politics behind it. It's not politics, it's the history of humankind. So I would not take, geometry or mathematics per se as a kind of field that can help the development of political thought without recognizing the history of these disciplines. then we can maybe discuss the quote by Grottingen about the relation between the finite and the infinite. But
There was no, discrete and continuous.
yeah, discrete and continue.
Thank you for that question. It was quite an involved question, and thank you for going first. It gave me some time to think about it. Thank you. So I listened. In a way, I'm still working through the answer to that question. The basis of working through it is thinking, actually beginning with Fred Moten, who in a way enacts a certain amount of frustration, right? And he's saying that actually the ontological project to look at contingency as a way out already exists in our lives. That's why I keep saying it's in the barber shop, it's in the, it's at the kitchen table, it's at everything that we actually practice in the everyday already illustrates the contingency that we want in the world, and how do we make that relationship. And so since I started sort of going down that path, I started to think in my own life where the mechanisms of machine learning actually already operate and in what types of ways. And one of the things that led me to was my mother's household. So, you know, my parents are split, so my mom was a single mother, working class. My father was chasing capitalism. So already during the class war, I'm going to be conflicted. But in my mother's household, everything was preemption, just based on the existing duress. So as a young black boy, the first time I went to the shop on my own, I'd already preempted police violence. I'm going to let you go. If the police stop you, here's how there was already a code. If something happens, you go to this house, there was already a spatial temporal mapping that didn't depend upon the reality of the situation. And this also enacted itself with capitalism as well. You know, there was a 6-month plan to my birthday. You know, what do you want to do for your birthday? And then you see her calculating. She's like, okay, pay minus the bill, minus the light bill, carry the 2. And then she would actually move my birthday. Like, great, so on the day of your birthday, we're not gonna do anything, but on this day, and I'm starting to think about those levels of life and necessity that already force us into a preemptive type of mode where it's not even necessarily, it's informed by duress, but it's not oppressive. Because what reveals itself in that modulation based on necessity is true meaning. So it no longer became attached to my birthday. I became attached to actually the effort that was put to negotiate that celebration. And that's what I'm saying is the opportunity that's missing within machine learning is there's so many opportunities for real, genuine senses of value that are being subsumed by this mundane, capitalist, geometric sort of system. And if we think about these sort of wonders, you know, even the presentation before, you know, about this deep sea, all these like wondrous things about how the world operates and what we've enacted this technology to do is just completely absurd. And so in a way, it sort of even goes to that dichotomy with you know, with even the space of engineering. And that's what I'm saying is, you know, Simonden's useful for me, and set it free. Because we'll kill each other before it will. So set it free to come up with a perspective, a perception that might possibly enable us to see each other, our world, and ourselves differently, because it maintains its own indifference anyway.
Just to just kind of echo what you just said, it's I mean, basically, in the end of the day, it's a certain like rigid economic profit necessity, or the certain incentives we have at play that make these things irrelevant. And that's a word that I just like to throw out here today. It's I recall seeing Isabel Stengers talk about this in relation to the sciences or something. So like basically to show how these certain incentive structures, they place constraints that make a lot of the research just frankly trivial, when we've got incredible brains, incredible people, so many capacities, and we're like, we'd rather have a cure for male baldness than like save human lives. Because why? You would make a shit ton of money if you figured out that formula.
On that note, I'm sorry, my friends. Our generous window of time has now closed.
thank you guys so much for the discussion and your presentations.